A common storytelling trope is that of the evil advisor. In fantasy stories, they're often the person sitting next to the one on the throne, whispering lies, conspiracies, or selfish ambitions into their ear, like Grima Wormtongue in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, or Jafar from Aladdin. The character type can be found in other genres of story as well, like a self-invested second-in-command, or a double agent in a political thriller, or even just a shifty member of the protagonist's inner circle. Judas Iscariot plays this role in certain stories from the Gospels, if you want a New Testament example of it. The exact relationship will differ between versions of this trope. Methodologies will be altered and motivations will find multiple points of contact, but the general action will be the same. The evil advisor tries to convince another to a course of action that is not to that person's benefit. Such characters attempt to sell foolishness as wisdom. It would be best for the one being given the advice to realize that wisdom is not found in these words, or at the very least have their story's version of Gandalf come in and whack some sense into their heads. But quite often, because fiction parallels reality in this regard, the evil advisor is listened to until it's too late. The rot infects, battles are lost, and greater failures lie ahead, all because the supposed wisdom was nothing but a dangerous illusion. In our time through the book of Samuel and the series we're calling A Song of Failures and Hope, we've been on the downward failure side of David's story arc. It started back in chapter 11 with David's adultery with Bathsheba and his conspiratorial murder of her husband Uriah. And in the last chapter we began this section of David's reign that could be called the Absalom years. It began with David's children following his example and sinning and raising it up a notch. Amnon, David's eldest son, raped his half-sister Tamar, and in retaliation Absalom, Tamar's full brother and David's third eldest son, successfully conspired to murder Amnon. And last we saw, Absalom fled to his maternal grandfather, the king of Geshur. Things look terrible for David. Sure, God still has a role and purpose for the king, and God's work continues despite the problems of this life brought about by human evil. But this whole time of the Absalom years has little light to be seen in it. God's role is allocated to the background while the foolishness of humanity rises to the fore. And in the midst of this flailing about to find wisdom, evil, or perhaps better human-minded advisors step up selling their merchandise that is nothing more than a dangerous illusion of wisdom. The full extent of this terrible advice won't be seen in this chapter, and honestly there is no good example for us to follow in the passage either. But at the very least, we will see where godly wisdom is not found, places where the people of God should never reach if wisdom is what we wish to find. And we start with Joab, back to his game-playing shenanigans, as we recognize the truth that wisdom is not found in deception. 2 Samuel chapter 14, verses 1-3. Now Joab, the son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart went out to Absalom. And Joab sent to Tekoa, and brought from there a wise woman, and said to her, Pretend to be a mourner, and put on mourning garments. Do not anoint yourself with oil, but behave like a woman who has been mourning many days for the dead. Go to the king, and speak thus to him. So Joab put the words in her mouth. General Joab had been through a lot with his uncle David. Starting way back to David's time on the run from Saul, Joab had been at or near David's right hand that whole time. And he'd witnessed the events of the past few chapters from a close vantage point. News of Nathan's prophetic parable from chapter 12 had no doubt become the talk of courtly gossip. How the fictional story that seemed so like a real case for David got him to realize the depths of his own sinfulness. As well, Joab had heard about his cousin's sinful actions from the last chapter, and saw David's anger yield to hesitancy because he was a parent who felt himself to be a hypocrite if he were to call out his children for the same sins that he had committed before. Years passed with David unsure of what to do, and Absalom's eventual self-imposed exile to Geshur left David's heart in conflict over the situation. For all of this, Joab had sat in his front row seat to witness, and he took it all into consideration as he saw the king sigh and shake his head at the whole situation. Someone needed to do something, so the general decided to step up in the role of advisor for the king. The passage is clear that Joab believed that returning Absalom back to Jerusalem was the best decision. But why that was the best decision is less clear. On the one hand, later verses seem to indicate that Joab considered Absalom to be the best choice for heir to the throne, the one through whom David's name would find its legacy. But certain other actions later on in this passage question this interpretation, because nothing beyond this plan to give advice is shown for Joab's support for King Absalom. So on the one hand, we might be seeing General Joab making a decision that he deemed was best for the kingdom. He'd been a part of one side of a split kingdom before. He'd led many battles to ensure David was victorious, and his whole time with Absalom off in a foreign land smacked of David's own time on the run. Perhaps Joab feared that Absalom would one day return with an army behind him to forcibly take the throne. After all, Absalom was very good with the people, a truth that we'll see hints of later on in this chapter and will witness in full next time. So with Absalom's amazing ratings in the polls, this could be seen almost as another Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s, only with David on the other side this time. Therefore, this move by Joab might be having David's enemies brought close so that Absalom will never have a chance to raise an army against his father. Regardless of Joab's motivations, he devises a plot to convince David that bringing back to Jerusalem was wise. A deceptive plan that plays on David's heartstrings while using a shallow imitation of Nathan's parable. In order for Joab's plan to work, he'd have to find someone far enough away so that the story wouldn't likely have come to Jerusalem, but close enough that the journey to the capital was not out of the question. So he goes to a town that's a handful of miles away from the city to find his assistant in this subterfuge, and he finds someone called a wise woman. This demarcation might be something that indicates her like a prophet, hence Joab's attempt to utilize the prophet Nathan's methodology. But one thing is for certain, it is not God's words that are put on this woman's lips. Also, this term of wise woman is odd because none of the words that she speaks throughout the entire chapter are actually wisdom. We'll see in the next section that every bit of her mournful guise is nothing but an illusion meant to manipulate David to perform the human-minded wisdom of Joab. Now, some might question what the difference was between Nathan's parable in chapter 12 and this fabricated story that's coming up in the following verses. Why was Nathan's not a deception when this is? Well, to begin with, Nathan had spoken God's words to the king, but the wise woman will speak Joab's words. However, in case that explanation doesn't convince you that both weren't manipulative, let's continue this line of thought. In part, this differentiation has to do with the fact that Nathan never claimed that his story about the two men and the sheep was a real case. Sure, David wrongfully assumed it was. But Nathan's purpose, and by extension God's purpose, was to give David an opportunity to see the truth from another perspective, much like Jesus' own parables in the Gospels, so that David might return to the ways of God. It was the purpose behind it that makes the real difference. See, this plan of Joab has the woman act like her case is real. There's a deception built in to begin with, and the conclusion was not for David to have a deeper relationship with God, but rather to do what the human-minded advisor thought was best. For the advisor, at least. We all know how Joab feels about being replaced as primary general in the army. Remember that back-alley assassination of Abner, right? General Joab wasn't concerned with getting things done God's way. He couldn't be sure that God wouldn't deal with the Absalom problem in his own timing, much as God had with Saul. And who was Joab to assume that Absalom would be the best inheritor of the throne? All of this points us to the idea that Joab was putting himself in the place of God. I mean, think about this. In chapter 12, God had put words in the prophet Nathan's mouth in order to tell a story that would cause David to realize the right course of action. And here, in this chapter, Joab puts the words in the wise woman's mouth to tell a story that would cause the king to perform the course of action that Joab thought was right. If we compare those two sentences, we see that Joab is literally putting himself in the same role as God. This is what happens when we seek wisdom from the devising of human deception. It sounds good and follows the right formula, but all it leads to is human-minded understanding. The things that we think are good without any regard to the ramifications or the ways of God. And, spoilers, will only lead to further troubles in this life, because deception is one of those human evils that brings about such troubles. We can't find wisdom by recycling misapplications of godly wisdom that only follow the considerations of humanity. The formula might seem correct, but will only lead to misery and more troubles in this life. We will fall for the deadly illusion too easily. Now that I've spent far too long on these first 3 verses, let's move on to another and highly related place that wisdom is not found. Manipulation. 2 Samuel chapter 14, verses 4 to 17. When the woman of Tekoa came to the king, she fell on her face to the ground and paid homage and said, "Save me, O king." And the king said to her, "What is your trouble?" She answered, "Alas, I am a widow. My husband is dead, and your servant had 2 sons, and they quarreled with one another in the field. There was no one to separate them, and one struck the other and killed him. And now the whole clan has risen against your servant, and they say, 'Give up the man who has struck his brother, that we may put him to death for the life of the brother whom he killed.' And so they would destroy the heir also. Thus they would quench my coal that is left, and leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the face of the earth." Then the king said to the woman, "Go to your house, I will give orders concerning you." And the woman of Tekoa said to the king, On me be the guilt, my lord the king, and on my father's house. Let the king and his throne be guiltless." The king said, "If anyone says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall never touch you again." Then she said, "Please let the king invoke the Lord your God, that the avenger of blood kill no more, and my son not be destroyed." He said, "As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground." Then the woman said, "Please, let your servant speak a word to my lord the king." He said, "Speak." And the woman said, "Why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in giving this decision the king convicts himself, inasmuch as the king does not bring his banished one home again. We must all die. We are like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. But God will not take away life, and he devises means so that the banished one will not remain an outcast. Now I have come to say this to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. And your servant thought, I will speak to the king. It may be that the king will perform the request of his servant. For the king will hear and deliver his servant from the hand of the man who would destroy me and my son together from the heritage of God. And your servant thought, the word of my lord the king will set me at rest. For my lord the king is like an angel of God to discern good and evil. The Lord your God be with you." The motivations behind the wise woman's manipulations have already been covered in the last section. And over half of this section's verses are an imaginary story, so let's speed things up a little bit. Basically, the woman's story claimed that she was a widow with only 2 sons, and one of them supposedly killed the other in a fury, but there were no witnesses. Now the rest of the family wants the heir of his father to pay for the murder. But there was some deeper greed in these imaginary family members' motivations. Because without a male heir, the father's possessions and lands would then revert to the rest of that family. They would have financial gain through this woman's loss. So the woman says that she's come to the king in order to allow a tiny bit of leniency toward the heir's sin, so that she wouldn't have to suffer the greed of the rest of the family. It would be an unfortunate set of circumstances if the story were true. But we can see through the manipulations pretty quickly here, since we know that the story is a total fabrication. Joab, through the wise woman, is trying to convince David that a tiny bit of leniency towards Absalom will prevent the king and his kingdom from having to suffer. And the fact that the story places the heir as Absalom's counterpart shows us that Joab considered Absalom to be the best choice for heir to the throne, though the comparison does fall apart when we remember that David had plenty of more sons. In verse 8, though, we see that the king wishes to take some time to consider the best course of action. He wants to help the woman's fake son, but isn't sure about how to best do that right now. However, because that won't help Joab's purpose, the woman presses the situation. She even assures the king that if things go poorly because of the rapid response, the blame is on her. So David tells her to bring back to him anyone who wants to harm her. But this still is not enough. No, the terms have to have the stamp of Yahweh on them, so she asks for more, which David finally agrees to. And at this point, the king has taken Joab's bait. So the wise woman asks for one more word, and that word is why. Why then is the king not doing the same thing for his own son in exile? If a little leniency is okay in her supposed situation, which she repeats is totally a real and actual report of events, then why doesn't the king find leniency in the case of Absalom? After all, Absalom's exile is also harming her, by depriving the nation of the king's heir. And she ends with a blessing of Yahweh as well, as if this whole thing were more than just the manipulations of Joab and his patsy. Again, showing that the deception and manipulation placed Joab in God's role, selling supposedly godly wisdom when it's nothing more than personal understanding and consideration. Nothing more than a human-minded advisor whispering manipulative deception into the ear of his king. While we can find wisdom in comparable situations, sometimes the comparison falls short, like how Absalom was not David's last remaining heir. And when the point of the manipulative comparison does not consider God's method of work, like the fact that Yahweh had chosen Solomon to be the next king of Israel, it falls short of true wisdom, and can obscure the truth by presenting only one perspective on the situation. A comparison that willingly disregards surrounding facts in order to convince someone that one course of action is the only way cannot lead to true wisdom, because wisdom considers the entirety of the events, something that no limited, finite human being can do. That's why we can only find wisdom from God, and the wisdom that he shares with his people. This act of Joab is nothing but propaganda, and there's a reason why it has the reputation that it does. Back in 2 Samuel, we see that, to David's credit, he at least recognizes the strings, and the puppet master behind this manipulation. But at this realization, the woman calls an audible in how to sell this deadly illusion. and she switches to another place that wisdom is not found. Flattery. 2 Samuel chapter 14, verses 18 to 24. Then the king answered the woman, "Do not hide from me anything I ask you." And the woman said, "Let my lord the king speak." The king said, "Is the hand of Joab with you in all this?" The woman answered and said, "As surely as you live, my lord the king, one cannot turn to the right hand or to the left from anything that my lord the king has said. It was your servant Joab who commanded me. It was he who put all these words in the mouth of your servant. In order to change the course of things, your servant Joab did this. But my lord has wisdom like the wisdom of the angel of God, to know all things that are on earth." Then the king said to Joab, "Behold, now I grant this. Go, bring back the young man Absalom." And Joab fell on his face to the ground and paid homage and blessed the king. And Joab said, "Today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight, my lord the king, and that the king has granted the request of his servant." So Joab arose and went to Geshur, and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. And the king said, "Let him dwell in his own house. He is not to come into my presence." So Absalom lived apart in his own house, and did not come into the king's presence. The words of the wise woman sounded too much like Joab to David. The general had been at David's right hand for a very long time, after all. The vocabulary was right on course with what Joab would say. So David calls the woman out on it, using his kingly authority to get her to answer truthfully for the first time in the conversation. But notice how quickly she offers her flattery up to David. "Oh, great and discerning king! No one can get anything past you. There's great understanding in you, your highness." Yeah, If he were such a great and discerning king, why did you feel the need to come sell wisdom to him? He's wise enough to see through your deceptions and manipulation, but not wise enough to know what to do in the situation? I don't think so. I mean, look how thick she lays on this flattery in the second half of verse 20. "You have the wisdom of a messenger of God, knowing all that there is on the earth." She's been caught lying to the king. Sure, at the behest of the general, but still, people have been sent to the sword for less. Right now, the wise woman is doing everything she can to leave the king's presence with her head still on her shoulders. Her bravery in the last section to dare to speak with the king for the nation has turned to cowardly groveling mixed with a ton of flattery. Those who seek their own human-minded considerations quickly show their self-centered purposes after being caught out, and want to fade into the background until their next moment arrives to peddle their foolishness wrapped up in the guise of wisdom. Notice how quickly the woman completely disappears from the story once David confronts Joab. She leaves a cartoonishly shaped hole of herself in the wall of the throne room the second that David turns his attention away from her. Also notice, though, how Joab picked up on the flattering ways of the woman. Even though David has granted the request to bring Absalom back to the city, Joab falls on his face as well, and uses clumsy poetry to keep up the flattery. "Your servant has found favor in the eyes of the king. The king has found favor in his servant." Just because you evoke parallelism, that doesn't mean it's poetic, Joab. The only way that it would be worse poetry is if it rhymed as well. But this sickening poetry shows us something true about flattery. It's a mockery of humility. Much like how all of this foolishness is sold as wisdom, flattery is a type of manipulation that sells itself as humility. It's meant to boost someone up above ourselves with ego-inflating words, but it's all just a bunch of hot air. All for the purpose of getting our way or getting away once we've been called out, and can even be used, like Joab does, as a means for getting our way later, because we've been humbly servile before. But there's a difference between being humble and sniveling. The former proves wisdom, while the latter proves foolishness. The problem, though, is that such flattering words often work, like how they do with David. He allows Absalom to return, not because of the wisdom of God, but because foolishness sold as wisdom has tugged at his heartstrings, while the follymongers flattered his ego. Sure, David still keeps a distance from exactly what they want, because the fact that David refused to meet with Absalom shows that he wasn't willing to make him heir to the throne. But still, compromise with foolishness leads us into folly. Incremental movement is still harmful when it moves us away from God's wisdom. Flattery is merely false humility that leads us to take a tiny step toward foolishness, a hook to bait us toward deadly ends. Another hook is in the next place where wisdom is not found, charisma. 2 Samuel chapter 14, verses 25 to 28. Now in all Israel there was no one so much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head there was no blemish in him. And when he cut the hair of his head, for at the end of every year he used to cut it. When it was heavy on him, he cut it. He weighed the hair of his head, 200 shekels by the king's weight. There were born to Absalom 3 sons and 1 daughter whose name was Tamar. She was a beautiful woman. So Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem without coming into the king's presence. I told you that we'd get to the hint of Absalom's high ratings in the polls. The description reads like a fluff piece of propaganda. Vote for Absalom. It's here where we see the fact that Absalom took after his father as a pretty boy, the sexy one in the newest boy band. No one was prettier than Absalom. He just oozed charisma. Surely he'd make the next great king, right? Well, what is it that we know about God's choice for king? Saul had been quite handsome and very tall, but God had only chosen him to be king because the people had rejected his own reign over them. And Saul had turned out to be more invested in those polling opinions that continued to speak of his appearance. Opinions that led him to be a raging lunatic at someone who dared rate slightly higher than he did. Oh, and when Samuel had been sent to the home of Jesse to find the next king, the firstborn who'd had a regal look to him was rejected outright, along with every other proposed son, until we got to the one who wasn't even supposed to be there. God even said that he doesn't look at the outer appearance, he looks at the heart. Sure, David was pretty, and grew up into a man of great appearance, but it was his faithfulness to God that had caused him to be chosen. The fact that David was the type of person who stood up to the mighty problems of his life and said, "How dare you mock Yahweh? If no one else will stand before you for him, I will. Yahweh will put you down by my hand." That is the man after God's own heart. Not this king who wallows in his feelings of hypocrisy. Not the king who takes ever-failing steps closer to foolishness. And it certainly isn't anything close to this murderous son of the king. This charismatic poster boy who was so selfish that he even used his own comfort as a personal press conference. I mean, look at verse 26. It tells us that once a year he made a big deal about his haircut. For years it sounds like people gathered in anticipation to find out how much his hair weighed this year. 2 to 4 pounds of hair, depending on what exactly the king's shekel at the time was. Grown in the course of a year. The hair was weighty, but nothing else was. This charismatic attempt to find substance proved itself to be as weightless as a wind-blown strand. Charisma is a pale comparison to wisdom. They can coexist, yes, but one will not be found in the other. And charisma without wisdom will lead to nothing but petty selfishness that cares little for anyone other than the self, which leads us to the last place that our passage shows where wisdom is not found. Coercion. 2 Samuel chapter 14, verses 29 to 33. Then Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king, but Joab would not come to him. And he sent a second time, but Joab would not come. Then he said to his servants, "See, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." So Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Then Joab arose and went to Absalom at his house and said to him, "Why have your servants set my field on fire?" Absalom answered Joab, "Behold, I sent word to you. Come here that I may send you to the king to ask, Why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to be there still. Now therefore let me go into the king's presence, and if there is guilt in me, let him put me to death." Then Joab went to the king and told him, and he summoned Absalom. So he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. Absalom may have started out as an avenger for the one forced against their will, but he proves that he too can destroy for personal desires. Notice how closely Absalom follows his brother Amnon's example. He desperately craved something for years. With Absalom, it was a word from Joab to the king. But what he wanted wouldn't come to him. Then, with a coercive plan of destruction, he moved, calling his servants to do the dirty work. He wouldn't take no for an answer, either. Circumstances are different, sure, but the type of self-centered grasping is the same. Since Joab wouldn't accept his invitations for a face-to-face, he looked out to the field that joined Joab's own and said to his servants, "Send the general an invitation that he cannot refuse." And they lit the near-harvestable field on fire. Right on schedule, the general, likely soot-stained, arrived. Rage fueled Joab's words, to which I see Absalom laugh and give a mocking apology before saying that it was all because of a misunderstanding. See, Absalom's other invitations hadn't worked, so he figured that this would. And the word that Absalom wanted was for Joab to continue his work in getting the prince back into the good graces of his father. Even though he was in the same city, the past 2 years had been their own form of exile. He might as well have stayed in Geshur for all the good that this return had done him. and Joab agrees. David finally allows Absalom back into his presence, and David returns Absalom to his royal place. It all sounds like a victory, because Absalom got what he wanted. Joab got what he wanted. And even David kind of got close to the returned relationship that he wanted. But we can still feel like something's wrong here. That's because we're seeing the foolishness under that illusion of wisdom. We've seen the incremental steps David took toward foolishness. He allowed deception into his presence, considered the manipulation as a good comparison, let the flattery build up his ego, permitted empty charisma to sway the people, and continued to do nothing to punish the coercion of his children. Step by step, David moved toward the acceptance of this folly, and returned an unrepentant sinner back into relationship with him. This is not godly wisdom. Yeah, God calls sinners into right relationship with him, but it is through repentance, humble repentance, that such return is possible. Without humility, godly wisdom is not found. It's merely an illusion, a recycled misapplication of godly wisdom that follows only the considerations of humanity. It's easy to fall for human-centered wisdom. Multiple steps will be required, sure, but it's still easy. As long as we continue to allow the whisperings of evil, human-centered advisors to speak their lies, manipulations, flattery, charisma, and coercions. Until we refuse to listen to their selfish devisings, we will continue to take one more step closer to buying their foolishness, until we've bought up their entire stock, and found ourselves in the midst of more troubles in this life, troubles that we walked into willingly. If the way that we move is not closer to the ways and truth of God, then we are stepping closer to folly, closer to troubles of this world brought about by evil, human-centered considerations of those advising us. Wisdom, godly wisdom, is not found there. It is found in humility, in submitting to the ways of God, even if others around us call us stupid or wrong for such outdated standards. Wisdom is found when we allow God to take the center stage of our thoughts, seeking first what He desires, not longingly looking for what we want and how to get it, but rather looking to Him and His plan, and then moving in line with it. If our focus is anywhere other than the work and ways of God, wisdom is not found there.